Tonight we're going to be looking at one of the most interesting and controversial topics in Catholic social thought. In fact, in the idea of moral economics, there's probably no topic which is more important than the topic of usury. Heinrich Pesch, a Jesuit from the early 20th century, described capitalism as state-sponsored usury. He was responding to Leo XIII's statement that the world was awash with rapacious usury, when Pope Leo was actually complaining about the way that business was done and the way that wages were inhuman, and yet he chose to use the expression usury. Usury specifically relates to interest or a return, a profit taken on a money loan. However, I think it's of the same nature, say metaphysically speaking, as what we're looking at earlier as the violations of just price, where you sell something for a greater price than that content that you own in it. And you might recall we were talking about the way that I own certain parts of the thing that I've got to sell, but I don't own your need for the thing. And we're going to come back to this when we look at St. Thomas Aquinas, this idea of titles. What do I own? I can sell what I own. I can't charge for what I don't own. And this is very important in the question of usury. Usury is a very old problem. It goes right back well past the Gospels into the Old Testament era, and we find it as a problem in other cultures as well. And so we might begin by looking at usury in the Old Testament. Now, anyone who's taken a little bit of interest in this issue will be able to tell you that usury is banned right through the Old Testament. And so you find it in the early books of the Old Testament, in Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, references to usury. So many of them. I have a spreadsheet which is just a list of the references in Scripture, and the Old Testament ones certainly take up many kind of rows. Let's look at a couple of them. In Exodus 22:25, if you lend money to my people, to the poor among you, you are not to act as a creditor to him. You shall not charge him interest. Pretty easy, pretty straightforward. Who's poor? Well, in a sense, if you take a little step back from it, you may have greedy people who borrow for commercial advantage or something, but by and large, the people who borrow are the people who don't have. And what is a poor person? Somebody who doesn't have. And so the idea of looking at the poor among you is actually something that can be quite general. There have been arguments later on, and even at this time, that it's okay to charge usury against somebody who has money, who is rich, because after all they're just doing it for excess or what have you, but it's immoral amongst the poor. There's certainly good reason, which we'll be looking at later on, not to charge interest on a loan to the poor, but I would say of its nature, charging interest on a money loan to anybody is intrinsically of its nature, by the very stuff that it is, its metaphysics if you like, intrinsically immoral. Okay, so we have Exodus there, and as I say, that can be read fairly broadly. We move to Deuteronomy. We find that loans existed in the Old Testament, but the idea of debt forgiveness also existed and had quite a tradition by way of one of the many nice things that happened in the Jubilee. And so debt forgiveness was one of the good things, that if you owe money at the time of the Jubilee, then the debt is forgiven. Now, it's significant when you look at other things which happened in the Jubilee. When we're looking at real estate and property, the Old Testament property also had property returning to its owners on the Jubilee. What's this saying? Well, it's curious because for the Old Testament Hebrew, you could sell land But really what you're selling is a temporary interest, not a perpetual freehold. That's using a little bit of formal language, if you like. What I meant was that the land was given to its owners by God through the Mosaic law and so on. It could be alienated, it could be sold to others, but because it was theirs and nobody else's, it had to be returned at the Jubilee. And that was one way scholars who have looked at this saw that the Old Testament, certainly the early books of the law, were describing, amongst other things, an economic system which was intended to keep wealth well distributed and really flowing down from generation to generation amongst families, not allowed to concentrate. And so this concentration of wealth is a theme that we find in the 20th century in Catholic social thought. It's always been opposed in God's will. And so the Jubilee was one of the ways of doing that. And debt forgiveness was a part of this strategy, if you like, for avoiding the concentration of wealth. And so if you did have a debt, even without interest, it was returned. It was forgiven. Okay. Now, this next quote I find especially interesting and powerful. Ultimately, the Hebrews, the Jewish religion, if you want to call it that, is a tribal religion. It's a local religion. It's not a religion which is easily communicated to the whole world. It's not intended to. So you've got the chosen people, you've got the Gentiles. You've got God's chosen versus the great unwashed, who are not God's people. And this is important in the area of usury, because the Hebrews were permitted to lend money to the Gentiles. And we find a number of cases of this. Partly because the Jews, with a little bit of inside help from God, knew that the nature of a money loan was that it always weakened and in fact enslaved the borrower, regardless of what your good intentions are. And in Proverbs 22:7 we see, the rich rules over the poor and the borrower becomes the lender's slave. Now, in a sense, if you want to enslave people, if you want to do it the hard way, you go out with your swords and bows and arrows and whatnot, and you wage war and all that sort of stuff, and you might sort of bring home a bunch of slaves. And that's wonderful, and different people did that in the ancient times. However, the Jews discovered, were told perhaps, a far tidier way of getting slaves. You go out to them like the Commonwealth Bank does and say, we'll help you own your own home. We'll lend you some money, right? The borrower becomes the lender's slave. And so it was understood that if you want to oppress, the Gentiles or the Philistines or anyone else that you don't like, you go out and you smile at them and you give them the money and you charge them interest, and eventually they'll end up becoming your slaves. Proverbs basically saying don't do it. But it was permitted because of this tribal nature of the Jewish religion. Then we get to the Psalms. Psalms are lovely. Lord, who shall be admitted to your tent and dwell on your holy mountain? Goes through a number of qualities of those who will reach their eternal reward. And towards the end is he who takes no interest on a loan. Pretty clear. If you want to get to heaven, don't take interest on a loan. Now, they're just a handful of references, and you find them all over the place, basically saying the same thing. Don't take an interest on a loan. It's a form of oppression, and you won't get to heaven if you do it. You're not going to be God's friend. Extortion, equated with usury. That's fairly simple and straightforward. When we get to the New Testament, we find it's a bit bare and bald. It's bald because our Lord doesn't specifically say the sort of things that were said in the Old Testament. He doesn't revoke them either. But if you look through the New Testament, and I went through the New Testament, in fact just the Gospels at one stage, only looking for references to money in the Gospels, and I found well over 30 places where money and wealth was referred to or given examples of in direct statements, in parables, in the actual doings of the disciples and so on, that all gives the same point of view, and that is that avarice, the love of money, is an evil thing. And we see this in Luke. No servant can serve two masters. You cannot serve God and mammon, God and money. The Pharisees, who loved money, heard these things and sneered at him. Well, we're seeing in Luke this development of the opposition between the people that Luke and the other gospel writers referred to as the Jews, who were trying to destroy Jesus, and the emerging acceptors of the Messiah, who were also Jews, but followed Christ. And the Pharisees were putting their lot in with money, basically. And you see this over and over again in the New Testament, especially in the Gospels, but you also find lots and lots of references in it, in the epistles as well, even down to the selection of deacons and priests and bishops. One of the criteria is they must not love money. The love of money is the root of all evil. Store up treasure for you in heaven. All of these references. So the love of money is seen as something quite evil. And likewise, this positive recommendation, the use of money. What is money for? It is to be used to win you friends. And we find in other places the idea of lending without expecting a return. St. Thomas Aquinas looked at this because a number of people looked at it and said, whoa, not only is Jesus saying don't take interest on a loan, but he's saying don't even get the principal back. Right? And when St. Thomas looked at this, I probably should have put it up on the PowerPoint here, what St. Thomas said was that this double charity with using money, first of all, it fits in to the overall theme of the gospel, which is really the perfection of the law. But as well as that, it looks at the way that for St. Thomas, he said, well, there are two parts to it. If I lend money to you and I don't charge you interest, that's something that I do to you in justice. So as well, avoid lending money at interest in justice, but then I don't take back the principal in charity. And so this combination of justice and charity finds its place in this recommendation to lend without expecting a return, anything back. And I think that's an absolutely delightful aspect. We're going to be coming to this when we get to look at liberality and magnanimity in a future session. So it's quite an important concept. And so that's what we look at in usury. So the narrow notion of usury doesn't get a lot of attention in the Gospels, but it's there as a part of this overall attitude to money and property, especially the antithesis between loving God versus loving money. Let's move forward now to the Christian era. Okay, so what happened through the church's history with regards to usury. What we see is that in the early centuries, the immorality, the rejection of charge of an interest on a money loan progressively became firmer in early Christian practice. Okay. And so I'm saying it crystallized into a strong position in those early centuries. Interest on a money loan was considered illegal and immoral, roughly from the period of Constantine, the adoption of Christianity by the Roman Empire, to the reign of Henry VIII, who was the first monarch in Christendom in about 1,000 years to make it legal to charge interest. Up until that stage, Christians were not permitted to charge interest. Now, a lot of ducks and dodges that they did because there's a lot of it's easy money, basically. But officially, it was illegal and immoral until Henry VIII said you're allowed to charge up to 5% on a loan, and that'll be okay. And because he was the head of the Church of England, the Anglicans were able to start their banks and stuff, and it was a bit of an incentive for Catholics to become Anglicans because they make a lot of money really easily without going to hell, which is a nice idea. Now, I mentioned that the practical avoidance of charging usury was being eroded. Okay, and roughly through the medieval period, especially from about the 12th century onwards, but it was kind of happening all along. And you find that human weakness, frailty, we tend to like the easy way out, and so we find ways around. And there are a number of ways of effectively benefiting in the same way as earning interest on a money loan without actually calling it interest. Things called a triple contract, which I won't have enough time to go into. It was developed during the medieval period as a way, a kind of complex financial relationship that include 3 simultaneous contracts, work just like you're earning interest, but officially it wasn't earning interest, and so you didn't have to have a confession for it. Okay, the triple contract is a controversial idea. Even now, scholars look at it and say, did it work? Wasn't it? I think you can sort of dissect it and take it apart. But there are a lot of issues that we won't have enough time to go into tonight. Okay, what we want to do is just look at the history of it and the overall kind of framework, what it is. We want to look at the essence of it and sort of look at what the issues are for today. Okay, but lending was happening under the guise of delayed payments and things like that, and people were becoming poor as a result. The borrowers were becoming the slaves of the lenders, although lending again was kind of hidden in medieval Christianity. Okay. The church responded by the development of a kind of, a bit like a building society, I guess, a thing called a Monte di Pieta, which was a pile of goodness. And it really sort of, it got started as a pile of money that was typically donated by wealthy people. It was administered by the church, often by Franciscans, interestingly enough, who sort of loved poverty, so it was kind of appropriate for them to do it because they didn't get their fingers sullied because of their very clear understanding of what money was about and the temptations of it. Monte Pieta, or the Montes as they were known as, kind of worked like banks. They would lend money and they only earned a return from the loan sufficient to pay the operations of the Montes. Okay, so basically, fed the administrators of these things that were kind of like banks, but they didn't charge interest. And there are a number of things that act like banks that don't charge interest around the place. The Montes were one of them. Some people come along and they criticise them and they say, well, the Montes were actually, you borrowed 100 silver pieces and you had to pay back 106 silver pieces, what have you. So there were six silver pieces of usury in there, and so they were really kind of prototypical, subversion of usury. In some cases that might be true, but I think in general the Montes had their heart in the right place. There are probably ways that they could have done it better, and again, that's a topic for another time. But whatever they were an attempt to give dignity back to the poor people who still needed money in order to function in the environment at the time. Okay, so as I say, a little bit of complexity there, but that was Church's response. Then you had the Protestant rebellion. Now, I've already mentioned Henry VIII. It was said by Odd Langham when he looked at the question of usury through history in a book called The Aristotelian Analysis of Usury, that as the Reformation swept through Europe, the prohibitions against usury fell. And what he was saying there is it was just a happy coincidence that even though officially usury didn't have a carte blanche under Calvin or Luther, effectively it did. Okay, and again, that's a topic for more detailed discussion if you want. But basically, the Protestants were able to let bankers have a bit of a free rein. Now, you have the Council of Trent, Counter-Reformation, and so on. And so we get the Catechism of the Council of Trent. Now, if you want to look at council documents, the Catechism of the Council of Trent is a really lovely place to start. You see the church describing its faith and morals in a delightful way in the documents of the Council of Trent. The Catechism, in its treatment of the sin of theft, treats usury as one of the first major forms of theft and one of the most significant. Now, when the church talks about sin, it doesn't talk about venial sin. When the Council of Trent described usury as one of the most potent examples of theft, it was talking about a mortal sin. Go to hell. Sin. Okay. And it's very clear there in the Catechism of the Council of Trent. However, there were practical complications. You had Henry VIII making it legal for charge of interest. And the church, unfortunately, took a little bit of a step backwards. Of course, we're now talking about the 16th century, and so we're a few centuries after St. Thomas, and by that stage the understanding of usury, a lot of people thought about it, and we're going to be going into the theory of it as we go along. A lot of people were starting to sort of think, oh, this is actually a bit more complicated than it appears, and so the church took a bit of a step backwards. You have St. Peter Canisius, a great Jesuit saint, and he was refusing to give absolution to German bankers. Come along to him, bless me, Father, for I've sinned, I've lent money, at interest. And he would say, well, you better give the usury back, and then you can sort of, we'll come back and talk business, right? So he refused to give absolution. And the German bankers didn't like it. The German bankers were very powerful, and I think they were probably slipping a little bit of money into various parts of the organisation at the time. And word got back to Rome. Now, this is kind of an interesting case because St. Peter Canisius was actually censured by the Pope over his practice, and he was told to basically desist. And so you have this complication coming in. St. Peter Canisius is still a saint, and the question then starts to sort of take a bit of interest. What did the Pope say? He said, we're not competent, this is an argument that you find in the 20th century and sort of now still going, we're not competent to really understand where usury begins and ends, and therefore it's a bit unfair to these poor old German bankers who are trying to feed their family and all that sort of stuff. We're not really competent to say where usury begins. Okay, so don't worry about it. And this started this tradition in the church of considering usury not as interest on a money loan, but excessive interest on a money loan. Okay? And so this idea of excessive interest, that theme, has a long pedigree, and it's something that has to be considered fairly carefully. A bit later than St. Peter came Vix Purvenit in 1745. Vix Purvenit is the last major statement by the church. It's a papal encyclical for a letter for the whole church, and it deals specifically with the question of usury. And what Vix Purvenit does is that it asserts that interest on a money loan, pure interest, pure usury, is immoral, mortally sinful. Great. That clears up the problem. Vix Purvenit then notes that that's always the case for pure interest. However, there are occasions when it's licit to charge more. And we can go back to the Montes. Okay? And here we have to now start to distinguish between my title to extra payment because of the loan itself. In other words, a title to an increase inside the nature of the loan, right, intrinsic to it, a part of it, kind of like welded within it, compared to some accidental external thing, which is kind of external to the loan, but it's still a factor that I have to take into account. I'll be coming back to this if we get time later on as we go along. But an example, for instance, is risk, or perhaps the administration charges that we looked at with the Montes. As I say, I think the Montes could have been a little bit more, shrewd in the way that they did that particular costing, but it sort of gives us an example. We refer to these as extrinsic titles. Okay, so if I lend money to different people in need, I may lend you 100 pieces of silver, somebody else 100 pieces of silver, somebody else 100 pieces of silver, and through experience, I discover that if I do that to 10 people, just because of human weakness, most likely, on average, maybe one of those people will just disappear with money. Okay? What that means is that while I might have lent 10 times 100 pieces of silver, I expect to get 1,000 pieces of silver back. That's mine. I do the lending in charity, but in order to be able to get my 1,000 pieces of silver back, given the realities of the relationship. It's licit for me not to make money out of the loan by charging you and the other 9 people who actually sort of pay my money back a little bit extra. Let's say an extra 10 pieces of silver each. Okay. But what it means is, or 11 I think, so by the time I get 9 people, let's say, paying me 111 pieces of silver back, I end up with 999, and I guess we could put some decimals in there as well. But basically I get my 1,000 back. Okay? So while I'm charging you extra, I'm not making extra. That's extrinsic. So these extrinsic titles, they're not actually making a profit, they're not sort of coming from the loan. And we have to sort of make this distinction all the way along, and that's really, really important. And so Vix Purvenet says, well, we've got to work out where these extrinsic titles are and what they are. The intrinsic stuff, it's not there, so we don't have title for it, it doesn't exist, therefore I can't charge on it. The extrinsic, sure enough, we have to make accommodation for that. Okay, that's pretty much where the church left. Now, 1745 is a long time ago. That's, a couple of centuries ago. And we're still waiting for a development, if you like, or the answer to that question of where are the extrinsic titles and how do we quantify them. I think that in the 20th century, economics and especially finance developed the tools to be able to answer the question that was set by the Pope in 1745. However, for whatever reason, certainly in the last 50 years or so, not very many people have taken an interest in actually putting those two things together. The question of Vix Purvenet and modern finance especially. I think modern economics is another story because it's kind of a bit more all over the place. But finance, I think, is a bit more shrewd. Okay, so that's usury in the Christian era. I guess that generally paints the picture that usury is not highly thought of. It's a mortal sin. But on the other hand, you've got this pressure all the time to sort of come in under the radar to a certain extent, find some way around it. Through this time in history, in Christian history, by the way, there were banks and there was borrowing and lending. Generally, there's a kind of a strange symbiosis between the Christians in Europe and people who were allowed, in fact encouraged, to lend to their enemies. People who had been told by God himself hundreds of years before Christ that if you want to subdue an enemy, the best way to do it was to lend money. In fact, they even have a proverb to go and help. And so we have this tradition of Christian communities relying on Jewish moneylenders to supply them the debt that they wanted. And so they were able to borrow money from Jewish moneylenders. And in fact, the Jewish moneylenders were welcomed into Christian communities because people like to be able to do the same things that they do with their credit cards, live nice today on the basis of repaying tomorrow on the Never Never scheme. And the Jewish moneylenders like that because they are able to earn an income without doing any work. The Christians were able to live well until they suddenly discovered that they were enslaving themselves. And so that's kind of a thing which kind of went on through time. And again, that's a topic for itself as well. But basically that relationship was going on. And there are a number of interesting, in England, for instance, at one stage, one of the King Henrys, it was one of the early King Henrys, which one sort of escapes me for the moment, but at one stage he wanted to raise a tax, he wanted to fight a war, he wanted some money, and he knew that it wasn't going to be very popular for him to raise a tax by simply taxing his own people. He also knew that his own people, while they borrowed from the Jews, they actually hated them, and so he came up with a really neat solution. He issued a law where he put a tax on the moneylenders. Now, it was kind of interesting. So really what he's doing is taxing these resident aliens who were lending money, who were enslaving people. People didn't like it, so he was really popular with his people. Okay. The neat thing was he was able to raise his tax money to fight his war without taxing an Englishman, not a cent, but, a shilling. Right? The question is, though, who actually paid the tax? One other little wrinkle in there, by the way, was you'd expect the Jews to be rather cross and upset about this, being sort of picked on by the king and all that sort of stuff and treated unfairly. Well, the king said, well, yeah, okay, you guys are getting a bit of a hard time. We know that you're, not sort of terribly popular when you go to foreclose and ruin people. So if you pay the tax, I will guarantee you the protection of the royal army. And so the Jews went from being these, people that were sort of hounded out time from time to time when they foreclosed, to people who could just kind of call on the king's guard to come and sort of protect them. So they were happy to pay the tax. And of course, all they had to do was raise the interest rates a little bit, and they didn't feel it at all. And so who paid the tax? So you got this kind of complexity going through, the history of Christendom. Okay, and then you have on the other side people seeing that this was a really easy way to make money, and so that was attracting the Christians to play along the same game. Okay, this all then leaves us with the problem of, well, if there are these different perspectives, people want money, people are lending money, Henry VIII allowed it, what's the answer? Is there a way of understanding whether charging of interest is some arbitrary, dumb, oppressive law that supposedly is kind of coming from the words of God, or is it something which is actually built into the very fabric of the nature of money and so on, the nature of things, the metaphysics of it? Okay, now we come to looking at what I'm going to call interest theories. Now there are two groups of interest theories: the classical interest theories that go back, ancient times, and we've got the modern interest theories that we're going to be looking at if we get time a little bit later. Aristotle was one of the first notable people to write on this, and his approach to interest was known, his theory of it is known as the sterility theory. It works like this. Money is not like a machine or a cow or fields or something. Okay? It doesn't naturally produce anything useful. If I have a cow, it produces milk, it produces other cows. If I have a machine, it might sort of pump out whatever the machine is making or doing, or however it helps me. And so simply having a hammer is a productive thing. It makes me able to, a wheelbarrow, I'm able to carry so much more. Whereas money is actually not like that. Money is useful for buying things, but you can't eat it, can't wear it, doesn't keep the rain off. Right? The only thing you can really do with the stuff is swap it for things which are useful. And in a sense, if all you're doing is swapping it for other things which are better, then it kind of says it's kind of pretty inferior kind of stuff. Right? But when you sort of take that down, this idea that money does not make anything in the way that seeds make things, and this idea, it sort of fits into an agricultural economy. The sterility argument today looks a bit funny because people say, well, hey, what's all this stuff about money being sterile? I can put my money in the bank and the bank gives me interest, so $100 becomes $110 and da-da-da-da, all that sort of stuff. Okay. But Aristotle would come back and say, oh, that's all fine until you look at what the bank is doing. The bank is lending that money to somebody in order to give you the extra interest. Okay? And so it's kind of being pushed kind of down. And the person who borrows the money from the bank, what do? Well, again, they turn the money into something productive in order to, pay off the loan. And so if I borrow, I don't know, $100 or $100,000 or something for some particular purpose, maybe to start a business, it's the business which is making the money, earning a profit. It's not the money itself. What if I don't know, get a courier run or something? I might need $100,000 to set myself up with a van and do whatever else, pay my insurance and whatnot. But it's me running around delivering all of those things, which is making the income. And sure enough, I borrowed $100,000. I have to give the bank maybe an extra $10,000 a year. Okay. But it's not the money which is making the extra $10,000, it's me running in and out with all those little packages. Yeah? The money itself is sterile. And so this idea that money does not produce any natural direct benefit is very important. Now there are some problems with the sterility argument that does get a little bit complicated. It's still, I think, fairly persuasive. But it certainly gives you a bit of a flavour from the way this works. However, when we get into the Christian era, we find that while we might sort of tip our hats to the sterility argument, it's actually not the argument that the church has relied on primarily. I mean, apart from the positive arguments, the statements from Scripture and so on, the church's approaches to the question of usury, we find that there are a number of theories, but I think probably the most elegant and certainly I think the most persuasive, well, it does take a little while to go and get your head around it, is what St. Thomas described in the second part of the Summa in question 78. Okay, so I'll just give you that reference, and it's a nice one to go off and read, because the Summa is always a delight and always edifying. But what's St. Thomas saying there? Well, to go over this argument, St. Thomas's approach is what's come down to us known as the argument from consumptibility. It's an odd word, but a consumptible is something which is used up in being used. Right? And so my hammer is used without being used up. I can use my hammer for a long time without it wearing out. I can use a house for a long time without it being used up. I can use my cow to give me milk for a long time without the cow wearing out as a result of giving milk. Now, the cow might have other things going to happen to it, but it's actually not the business of giving milk which causes it to wear out. But money, the only thing you can do with money is spend it. And what St. Thomas would say, and this is a little bit tricky, he would say there are two ways of earning an income from something. One is where I use something up in using it, and that might be like paint. If I paint a wall, the use of the paint comes from using it up, so I charge you for the paint. Really what I'm charging you for is the ability to have a nice green wall, blue wall, white wall, whatever it is, right? And so that's a usefulness. I can charge you to the extent of the paint's ability to give you the coloured wall. The other thing is, the other reason for being able to charge things is when you're using something which is being used productively. And this is the hammer and the house and all those sort of things, which in a sense are naturally productive. They naturally satisfy some human need or want. Now, money is kind of curious. If it's like paint, it means I can only ever charge for its usefulness in doing the job that it does, which causes it to be used up. I can't charge you for paint, to the extent of maybe 3 white walls full of paint, if I only give you a bucket of paint which can do 1 white wall. And so basically when I finish using the thing, when it's used up, then I can't charge you anymore. That's different to a house where I can charge you rent for that forever, as long as the house is going to hold together, right? Okay, when you look at money, what happens when you borrow the stuff? Most people don't borrow money in order to just have it sitting around idly in the corner and looking at it. If I borrow money, I'll borrow money maybe to buy a car. And so how long do I have the money just kind of sitting around in my pocket? For a very short time indeed. In fact, the first thing I do as soon as I get the money is go out and buy my car. Same thing with a house. If I take a mortgage to get a house, I don't actually take the money until I get the house. Right? What that means is that as soon as I get the loan, I use the money up. It actually disappears. Right now, I borrowed a whole lot of money to buy this house. How much money do I have sitting around? None. Got a house. The house is here, the house is good, there's no money. The bank might be saying, well, you owe us $500,000 or whatever it is. Well, yeah, that's fine, except I don't have any money. I don't have the money just kind of sitting around looking at it. It's not doing me good. It's not, I didn't borrow the money to be a paperweight or something, right? And it's gone. It just doesn't exist. Now that's a very difficult idea to get your head around. Right? The fact that when you borrow money, you use it up and then it's gone. What it means though is that you then look at, well, how much can I charge for it? Well, if I borrow $1 in order to spend $1, I get $1's worth of benefit from that money. I'm swapped it for a Mars bar or something. I get the delight of my Mars bar. Whether I eat the Mars bar or not doesn't matter. I get the delight of buying the thing. But after that, the money can do me no good. So what benefit have I derived from borrowing the money? I've derived exactly $1 worth of benefit. And so what's my obligation to the lender? $1. That's the same whether I give the money back tomorrow or next week or next year or in 10 years' time. Because in any of that period, I never get any more use out of that dollar. It's gone. It's been consumed. That's the consumptibility argument. So the consumptibility argument would say that I can either be paid for the money in use or the money being consumed. Money is the sort of stuff that gets consumed, and therefore I can only pay it back once. And so it means that if I borrow, let's say $100, I have to pay back the amount that I've used. And St. Thomas would say that if I pay back the $100 plus 8% or something for the year, the 8% for the year makes it look more like a house. And I could pay rent, $8 per $100 of the value that I've got in the house. That makes it look like I've been getting a benefit from it through time, which I haven't. And so I can't charge for what I don't own. Goes back to the same principle that we find with the just price. I only own $100. You see, the converse is that I could perhaps borrow the $100, actually have it sitting in a corner where I just have it there. And I've got $100 worth of potential buying, which I don't actually use, but I still give back the $100 at the end. Okay? Now, both of those cases, whether I have the $100 sitting around dormant, not being used, in fact just taking up space and it's a bit of a security risk, in which case I pay it back because I haven't used the stuff, or whether I use it and then pay for what I've used, which is $100. That's what makes sense. When you kind of explain this consumptibility argument, it sort of starts looking like a bit of a tongue twister, just kind of saying all the other over and over again. But basically it sort of comes down to you can only get $1 for every dollar of money that you get. You can't basically double count. Usury for St. Thomas Aquinas would be like double counting. Okay, that's the consumptibility argument. It's probably good if you take that theory gently, because it does take a while to sort of settle in and see it, especially if you take the time to read through question 78, the second part, and just sit with it. It's easy to kind of be a reaction and say, oh no, I don't understand that, and give it away, but that doesn't really do it justice. Okay. Let's look at an illustration of the consumptibility argument. Let's imagine I borrowed 2 eggs from you and I put in a bit of labour because my object is to run a cake shop. Okay, and with those 2 eggs I make a cake, and that's really good. But once I get the cake, and the cake is my object, you see, the cake is the thing that I really want to do, whether to eat it myself or maybe to sell it for a profit. But that's my labour in making the cake, and the cake which is being sold, which is the thing which is profitable. The eggs have disappeared in the process of making the cake. And so whatever happens to the cake, the 2 eggs must be paid back because that's what I've taken from you. I've taken the sufficient eggs to make a cake. I haven't borrowed something which is going to actually be sitting in my cake shop and sold, if you know what I mean. Okay? And so the eggs are used up in making the cake. They don't exist anymore. I don't get any more benefit from them. I don't get the benefit of 3 eggs or 1.7 eggs or whatever. And so I simply only have that as an obligation. Another illustration which I think draws out the practical aspects of usury a bit more sharply. In fact, some people today are concerned not so much about the intrinsic nature of debt and debt funding and usury, but rather the way that the borrower becomes a slave to the lender. And there's also confusion because people say, well, if our society wasn't able to borrow money, how could people do anything? How could anyone afford a house if we couldn't borrow money? How can anyone start a business if we couldn't borrow money? Okay. What they forget is that there are two ways of people getting together, with one person with a bit of enterprise, one person with a bit of money, in order to do something productive, bake cakes or build houses or whatever it is. And in finance we refer to debt and equity. What this means is that if you want to go out and do something productive, maybe start a business, and we're going to use the example of maybe a dairy farm. You decide to go bush, you want to start a dairy farm. You're going to use your labour to look after cows, make milk, okay? But you don't have the capital to buy a cow. You might have gone to TAFE and you know how to milk cows, you know how to look after them, that sort of carry on. You simply don't have a cow. And you come along to me, I've got a bit of excess money in my pocket, and you say, look, I'm just done my TAFE course on being a dairy farmer, but I need a cow. How about if you got some money that you're not using, and we go in together. The cow's going to produce a bucket of milk every day, and the deal is I'll keep half a bucket of milk for my wages, and you can take half a bucket of milk to make up for the money that you've put into the venture. How does that sound? And I'm thinking, well, money's sitting under the bed, not doing anything. Far better off getting half a bucket of milk for it, and that's really nice anyway. And fresh milk sounds really good. So we go into our relationship. There are two ways of doing that. I could go down to the cow shop, buy a cow with my money, give you the cow, and say, well, there you go, there's the cow, you milk it, half-half, away we go. Now, our relationship there is what in business and finance we refer to as a equity partnership. My money has gone in, your labour has gone in, we both put something together, we're sort of partners in it, and my money has gone in as equity, which means I share in the profits of the business and also its risks. Okay? The alternative to that is for me to say, look, this all sounds complicated. You've been to TAFE, you know about all this stuff. I'm just not really interested. I don't even know what a good cow looks like from a bad cow, but you understand all that stuff. I'll tell you what I'll do. Don't worry about all this complication with a partnership deal. I will lend you $100. You give me half a bucket of milk. You give half a bucket, and you're happy. And it just kind of saves me a bit of fuss and bother. Okay? So the deal is $100 is given to you, and I get half a bucket of milk every day for as long as you've got my $100. Sound fair? Okay. To the modern mind, we'd say, yeah, of course, that's the way you do it. You just go down to the bank, get a loan, start your business, bingo, great. And so we've kind of become very familiar with this debt approach. The question is, when we're looking at this relationship, in both cases, we buy the cow, in both cases it's your labour, in both cases I get half a bucket, you get half a bucket. What's the difference between them? Doesn't that really say that all of this fuss and this antiquated Catholic sort of peculiarity about usury and that sort of stuff is a bit stupid, because they both give you the same result? Too easy. What's the difference in those two situations between the debt and the equity relationships? The Muslims, oddly enough, are onto this difference. If you think about it, this is going to be fine and dandy for as long as it goes fine and dandy. Think about what happens when the cow dies. If we're equity partners, you find yourself with all of the ability to go and milk a cow, but no cow. So you're a bit worse off, and you'll have to go off and find something else to do. My side, I've been sort of sitting around for a long time, getting my bucket of milk every day and sort of living quite dandy and enjoying that. I've had no fuss and bother. I didn't have to get my hands dirty or anything. The money or the bucket of milk, or half bucket of milk, has been coming to me every day for a long time. I've been really happy. I've taken, if you like, a certain risk position because of equity. If the cow produced 2 buckets of milk because it was a really good cow, or you were a really efficient milk producer or what have you, I would have benefited from that extra product. But now the cow's gone. I can look back and say, well, actually, that's sort of 5 years I've had sort of buckets of milk. I've already got my $100 worth. Maybe I might say, oh, well, it would have been nice if I'd, cow lived for a bit longer. Okay. On the other hand, if I lent you the money and the cow dies, remember the relationship there is that as long as you have my money, you're paying me half a bucket of milk a day. Cow dies. What's your situation? You now have no livelihood, but you have the obligation to pay me either half a bucket of milk a day, where are you going to get that from, or $100. Now, the only thing you're probably going to be able to do is go out and borrow another $100 from somebody, and that way you're going to sort of work away, get your bucket of milk, give half a bucket to the person who's lent you the money for the new cow, and you give me half a bucket of milk, and well, you starve to death. The lender is the borrower is the slave to the lender. You can see that debt and equity position, because it separates the risk of the productive activity, and the cow is the productive activity, not the money. And being involved in the risk, which is always associated with the productivity, in the equity relationship, there is a kind of natural allocation of risk and return, whereas in the debt relationship, because I've separated myself from the risk of the cow dying, but taken a return insulated from any practical risk, then I'm really taking a return for nothing. I'm getting money for nothing. It's immoral. Okay, I want to just bring this around now and look a little bit more generally at money, and this will kind of help us to see why, especially in the New Testament, it's avarice more than usury which is the target for our Lord's concerns. And understanding money is a useful thing. We look at money by looking at the notion of desire, because money is a good thing, people want it. But people actually want to live nicely. We want to be able to have a full tummy, warm back, be sort of sheltered when it's raining and that sort of thing. We have a number of desires. And we've already seen, I think, that this difference between the physical desires, which are for things like material comforts that make our life, are limited because we're limited creatures, and because they're limited, we get to an end to them, okay, and it's kind of proportioned to our input. Whereas the problem with money, or the curious thing about money, is that money has no limit in terms of its desire, largely because it doesn't directly satisfy any desire that we have. Okay? If I'm hungry, I can't eat money. If I have money, I can swap it for food, and that will satisfy my hunger. And so the real desire that I have, like the physical desire, which is hunger, is satisfied by money only when money is turned into something else. Okay? Curious thing about this is that because money does not satisfy any material desire, I never get to a point where I'm full up with my desire for money. I'm full up with my desire for a cup of coffee, or dinner, or warm clothes, or fast motor cars. But my desire for money is always in terms of, well, I've got a little bit more money. That means that if I get hungry sometime in the future, I'll have money then. If I get a bit more money, I'll be thinking, well, my desire for shelter at some point in the future will be, And so as long as I get preoccupied with money as a shelter for the future and so on, my desire for money is unlimited. It satisfies no material desire, and never being satisfied, it has no limit. And it's really the centerpiece for all of our finance industry. And so when we're looking at usury, the industry that usury leads into is the whole finance industry. When I first started studying finance, I found it curious. I'd come from an engineering background, and I was used to making money by doing things, by building things, designing things, what have you. When I got to finance, I discovered that the further you get into finance, the less and less interested you are in actually doing stuff. You're not really interested in whether you build a better motor car or a better rocket ship or whatever it is. You're interested in finding out how to make the production of the motor car turn more profit. So it might be the same motor car, but as long as you twist things around a little bit so you're making more money. So it's all work towards maximising money without really any necessary productive result coming out of it, which is kind of fascinating when you look at financial management and all the theories in it. And so financial motivation is all about maximising profit or usury, taking a return, without actually sort of changing any contribution to the community. It's all about usury. And we define finance as maximising the shareholders' wealth, and that leads us to, there's rather sort of distorted opinion. If you've got a finance perspective, you're not really interested in actually, producing anything useful to sell to the economy. You're interested in making it more profitable. It's a different kind of perspective, and I think it's one which, is kind of fairly transparently, short of having some ethical kind of foundation. I said there were classical interest theories and modern interest theories. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. In fact, I just want to go through this very, very briefly. The modern interest rate theories can be separated into the finance theories and the economics ones. I won't have enough time to go through the economics ones. They're a bit of fun because most of them contradict each other and they don't necessarily come to very useful outcomes. But that's probably a controversial issue that a lot of people might be a little bit concerned about, so I really don't want to go into that at this moment. But we'll look at the finance ones. Now, the finance theories about interest are really important because finance is about really understanding how to get the best result. It's very, very practical. And so the finance theories, I think, are being more practical. I think they're a bit more scientific than at least some of the economics theories. Okay. The first theory, probably the most important one these days, which dominates finance theory and financial thinking, is the way that, one way or another, the return, the rate of return, the rate of profit, the rate of interest, is related to the risk. And so the riskier a venture is, the more profit you expect. And there's a theory in finance known as the capital asset pricing model, which is intended to combine the profitability, the rates of return, to use finance expression, jargon, the rates of return for everything. Shares of BHP, shares on the stock market in general, loans, mortgages, loans to the government, like government bonds and so on. They're all priced, they all get their value because of their rates of return being related very closely to risk. And so the higher the risk, the higher the return, capital asset pricing model. And so it gives you, if you like, a pattern where if you have risk-free return, which is in capital asset pricing model theory, you use the government bond rate there because you say that the government bonds are risk-free because the government's really, really reliable. And so any other investment that I might make is going to be riskier than government bonds, and so I'm going to expect a rate of return which is going to be higher than it. That's really, really straightforward. It's almost too simple. So we could say that the capital asset pricing model is giving you this kind of risk insurance or this return for risk. The formal theory is the risk premium theory of interest. Now, that's all fine, but if I want to explain interest, that's only explained a slice of the interest. It's explained that part of the interest which is above the risk-free rate, okay? The government bond rate in CAPM terminology. What about this lump or this area underneath? There's another finance theory which comes in there to kind of help understand that. It's known as the time preference theory of interest. I won't go into that in great detail, but if you go down to the bank and say, I'm going to lend you my money, I'm going to put a deposit in the bank, and I want to be able to pull it out tomorrow, they'll give you a certain rate of interest. But if you go down to the bank and say, I will lend you some money and I'll let you do whatever you want to do with it and I won't take it for a year, promise. And in fact, you guarantee that, you contract it, right? That's a 1 year fixed deposit, okay? And you'll get a higher rate of interest because of this time preference. The bank has a preference for being able to use your money reliably for a year rather than have to sort of scratch around and find some money today and some money tomorrow and that sort of carry on. So they've got that certainty. And so that preference they've got for that time security means they're willing to pay more interest. And so depending on how long the money is tied up is how much of a wedge of interest there is there. And so I'm putting that in this diagram as this extra little slice, okay? Time preference. And so if I'm willing to maybe put my money in for like a 10-year investment, I expect to make more out of it. Now you can sort of add that to the risk premium and say, oh, that's fine. Now we're starting to understand how our interest rate, maybe on home mortgage has kind of worked out. Home mortgage is over 25 years and it's got a bit of risk, so that's kind of part of it. However, we still haven't taken account of all of the interest payment that I'm making. So there's a slice of it that's not explained, which is still that slice underneath. So there's another theory that comes to help, and that's called inflation coverage theory. And what that would say in finance, they would say if inflation is operating at, let's say, 3% per year, which tends to, in our country, this part of history, it really is only fair if the interest rate is at least 3%. So if I lend you $100 today, it's only going to buy me $97 worth of stuff in 12 months' time. So I need to be able to get an extra $3 for you, so I get $100 worth of buying power back in 12 months' time for $100 that I've given you today. Sounds fair. Okay? And it's not saying I'm actually making a profit out of this. It's simply the reality of inflation. Okay? And so, again, using 3%, I can sort of simply say, well, every return, whether it's a share with BHP or whether it's a government bond, that 3% I can take out. To use the classical expression, that's an extrinsic title. It's not making me money, it's simply making up for a loss. And we can see that these others are also intelligible as extrinsic titles. I'm not making money out of the time preference kind of mechanism. I'm simply making up for the fact that time preference has to do with risk over time and things like that. Okay, and uncertainties in inflation and so on. Okay, so that's all very good. So I've got these three common finance theories. I've still got this slice down the bottom which is unexplained. I would say that the unexplained part is pure interest. Now, to say pure interest would be a bit like saying pure theft, and so it's not polite to write that in a finance textbook. If you find this pure interest section explained in your finance text, you will find it's usually explained under the heading of expectations theory. And it kind of reads convincingly. Expectation theory looks like this. Expectations theory is the reality that if I lend you money, I expect to get a little bit of an extra above inflation and above my time preference kind of complications and above risk. I expect it. What's more, in an economy like ours, you expect to pay a bit more. After all, small's got to make a bit of a profit, doesn't he? So we all expect that. Now, that's fine, and in fact you can sort of wrap that expression up, or that theory up, in a way that makes it look kind of pretty, that's just the way the world works. People are like that. But when you unpack it, it's kind of a bit less convincing. If I lived on a pirate island, I might expect to get beaten up every night. Because the pirates like beating me up. And it's happened for as long as I can remember. And so when the pirate comes in, that's what happens. In the 1930s, there are these sort of movies about the mafia in the United States. They expected to get the insurance company from insurance money from the little operators who were just running little businesses, and the little businesses expected to have to pay it or get their kneecaps knocked off. Expectations. And so the expectations theory, while it's kind of alive and well in the finance textbooks, it's not really that convincing. I have from time to time, I haven't done it lately, looked at the returns in the Australian economy, and by the time you take out time preference and by the time you take out inflation coverage and use a risk-free rate, it looks as though the rate of pure interest is somewhere between 1.5% and 2%. I'm not quite sure if it's there now. As I say, I haven't done this exercise for a little while. But if I'm, let's say, borrowing money from the bank for my home mortgage, again, by the time you unpack all of those things, 1 or 2% is unexplained except in the expectations. And I would say it's pure intrinsic profit from the money loan. It's what in the old days would be called usury. Now, how does that sort of fit with the current position? And I'll just kind of close on that. There is a perception today, kind of coming, if you like, from the Vix Purveyanit kind of era, that usury is excessive interest. Now, to a certain extent, that's true, because if we use this diagram, we could say that it's excessive because what is not excessive is to charge a bit for risk, a bit for time preference, a bit for inflation, and maybe one or two other things that we haven't thought of here, but it's sort of justifiable in that kind of logic, what's called extrinsic titles in the old speak. The excessive part is the pure interest, which is simply the expectation. Okay? It's not the fact of the expectation, or the fact that everyone's used to 2%, therefore 3% or 5% is excessive. It's all of that part of the interest which is above those things which are explained, again using the older terminology of extrinsic title. Where does that leave us? It means that accepting the idea of the capital asset pricing model, and this is for those of you who have done a bit of finance out there, that would say that usury is not only a problem with banks, and it is a problem with banks, and it is not like most Catholic people would say, well, it's only those loan sharks, you know, the payday loans and the people sort of running the shonky credit cards and so on, that are charging huge amounts of interest. They're the people, the users, you know, us who sort of work for Combank or NAB or whoever. We don't do usury because we're only doing what everyone else does, and everyone expects that, and it's all kind of nice and competitive, and therefore we're clean. No, what we're saying here is that right through the economy, not just through the debt sector, through the banks and the government bonds and that sort of thing, but also right through the other capital assets, things like shares in businesses and so on. There is this element, this slice of pure interest. That's been around for a long time. When we have things like global financial crises, Great Depressions and things like that, I would say that it can be shown that they happen as a result of this usury debt mechanism rolling up over time to the point where the economy can't handle it and it sort of falls over and kind of recovers in some sort of fashion. That's a topic for another time. But one way or another, I think usury is alive and well, but we really have to go back to this question, because one way or another, it's right through the economy that we're in. It is still a mortal sin. All of these financial problems are soluble simply by putting our finger on usury and saying, no, that's immoral, it should be illegal. And let's look at ways of managing our societies, our economies, in order to take it out of the system. Nice way of solving a lot of problems.